Shabbat Shalom. Shalom. And Chodesh Tov to each of you. Some of our best stories come from right within our Tanakh, and we know this one quite well. It comes from the Book of Kings, part of our Nevi'im or Prophets section of our biblical canon. It is the story of the wise and just King Solomon who, in his prophetic and regal powers, must determine between two women who is the real mother of a child they both claim is theirs. Here's the kicker, the context. One of the women sadly gave birth to a child who died, and the other has a child who was born several days later and thankfully lived. The women argue before the king, and eventually he says, "Kechuli charev, fetch me a sword." And his solution is, as gory as it sounds, to propose cutting the living child in half. The woman whose son it truly was, overcome with compassion, begs the king to spare the child, and the other says, "Cut him, for that way he's neither mine nor yours." The story ends by saying that once Israel heard of this decision, the king determining the real mother, they were in awe at King Solomon, for they saw that he was imbued with divine power to execute mishpat, or justice. Although it is not part of our lectionary this Shabbat, this story was on my mind as we mark Parashat Mishpatim, which means, as we heard, laws or justice. On the surface, it might seem a little overwhelming in the details if you were paying attention, for Parashat Mishpatim outlines many, many, many different laws and ordinances from which Moses is instructing the people of Israel on behalf of God. However, it made me think about what different kinds of justice our ancient Torah is teaching us and how we might live by them as Jews of today. In highlighting our first idea of justice, it's a coincidence that Dahlia Lithwick is in our audience because this Shabbat is chosen as Repro Shabbat, in which the women of Reform Judaism, chaired by our own Sarah Charney, the National Council for Jewish Women, and other organizations, partner to raise awareness of the importance of women's reproductive rights and freedoms, particularly at a time where we feel that they are constantly under attack, though more so in the US than in Canada. Our partners choose this Shabbat on which we read Parashat Mishpatim, particularly because of this passage of verses, Exodus 21, verse 22 through 25, which, if you wish to follow along, can be found on page 515 in the Plout commentary. It reads as follows. When two or more parties fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact, the payment to be based on reckoning or bargaining. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. In other words, in another instance regarding mothers and children, if someone accidentally causes a miscarriage, only a financial penalty applies, which, if treated as manslaughter, would necessitate the death penalty, if we're going to cut to the chase of what our Torah was saying. So what might this teach us about a Jewish perception of justice? Firstly, that there is undoubtedly a political component. This is because the woman, whilst thank God she was okay, was still perceived as the property of her husband and damage had been caused. Justice then comes in the form of damage being rectified monetarily and the relations between neighbours being restored or maintained subsequently. We'll talk about this in a little bit. Secondly, however, there is a moral component, as our Torah makes value statements about the worth of a particular life. Morally, the Torah sees the life of a living, breathing woman, despite being the property of her husband or considered that way, as being inherently more valuable than an unborn child, no matter how tragic or accidental the loss. The woman's life is therefore worth another kind of compensation, should it be compromised, that being, as we heard, the death penalty for the one who killed her, compared to financial compensation, as is the case with a fetus. Justice is thus the right of the woman to be protected and to know that she is safe in her own body, with the baby being considered, in the words of the Talmud, as its mother's thigh. In other words, a limb, but not a whole entity. This brings us, and what I want to focus on now, is this last pasuk, the verse of that passage, that famous one about an eye for eye, a tooth for a tooth, and so on. Known in Latin as lex talionis, the principle of lex talionis, whilst it may be thought of as perhaps an ultimate Jewish idea of justice, Rabbi Plaut of Blessed Commentary, again, if you want to follow, this passage can be found on page 528 in one of his essays in his commentary. He points out that fewer sections of our Torah have been so misunderstood than this notion of which, on the surface, states that injuries to life and limb must be punished in kind based upon their seriousness. What may be considered as license for total retribution, Plaut contends, is more of a reflection on the judges and the interpreters thereafter, rather than on the text or its actual intent. Plaut reminds us that there are, in fact, no instances of physical retaliation being exacted in our Bible, and that this is further evidenced through other contemporaneous ancient Near Eastern law codes, including the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, for any of us who have a little bit of a historical background. The earliest law codes, Plaut teaches, are based on the idea that such offenses, like homicide, like adultery, were considered to be private and would be dealt with between individual parties, with the legal structure really only defining the amount of compensation that the injured, the wronged, could ask for. The state did not interfere or punish crimes in general unless the community's welfare was considered to be at stake. Only when the Torah and the Code of Hammurabi come along does the state enlarge its scope, and once it's entitled to enact punishment, scales it to the degree of injury, except when it comes to, or perhaps with the highest level being intentional homicide, where the offender was subject to the death penalty. The Torah therefore presents an important step in the development of criminal law by taking measures to limit private revenge, which was particularly helpful in relation to family or tribal feuds. So additionally, the Torah treats injuries to all people, female and male, rich and poor, as alike, except in some cases related to slaves, a feature of the time, causing the philosopher Philo to call these laws the interpreter and teacher of equality. Put simply, lex talionis in our Torah demonstrates an idea of justice as fair monetary compensation for damage, as we've spoken about, rather than a reciprocal physical retribution. And Plaut shows that our Torah to be based on a principle, generally, of human equality. Which brings us to, later in our parashah, in Exodus chapter 23, where Adam was reading from, we find the commandment, v'ger lo tilchatz, in Exodus 23, verse 9, that one should not oppress the stranger, one out of the 36 times that this commandment appears in our Torah. The reason our Torah gives us for this injunction is because we, in our own narrative, know what it is to be strangers in a strange land. We have shared this experience and know it deep in our souls. The Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael, a midrash, will pick up on a similar thought and teaches us that strangers and the other are beloved in our tradition because we have known the heart, we have known the soul of a stranger. As a result, we are acutely aware that as a stranger's past is to their disadvantage, especially in a society that someone was not born into. Our texts remind us again and again that we are to treat the stranger and the other with special care and dignity. As it evolves, therefore, justice equally becomes the imploration to be treated fairly, equally, empathetically, and free from preconceptions. As history and story march on, that midrash is symbolic of the development of what could be termed an Exodus consciousness. Rabbi Sidney Schwartz describes how, aside from a founding myth, a common history, and a shared leader, which characterized a political consciousness in the Israelites, by the time that we find the Israelites in Mishpatim, wandering through the wilderness, an Exodus consciousness transcended these typical political conventions. This consciousness meant and continues to mean that Jews look after one another, no matter how many thousands of kilometers they might be separated by, whatever language they speak, whatever denomination they affiliate or not with. It is the belief in a shared destiny, a shared memory, a belief that would eventually explain the success of the Zionist dream being realized after 2,000 years of dispersion, and why in our post-October 7 pain, Israeli and diaspora Jews feel that indescribable and palpable closeness to one another more than ever. So as we began with our prophets, let us end with our prophetesses in honor of Repro Shabbat. May justice mean safety, protection, freedom, autonomy, and the compassion and consciousness to care for those around us, just as the prophetess Miriam ensured the safety of her brother Moses floating down the Nile, and then danced with the other women and their timbrels as they crossed the shores of the Red Sea. May justice mean, like the prophetess Deborah under her palm tree, a discernment and wisdom which engenders trust in our judgments. May we, as we sing words of Hallel to welcome in the Hebrew month of Adar, take its words to heart and pray that we may always work to open a Sha'arei Tzedek, a gate of righteousness and justice, that they may be opened for us in turn. Shabbat Shalom.